What if I told you the US dollar, the most powerful currency on Earth, almost collapsed overnight? Not because of war, not because of a foreign invasion, but because of a quiet decision made behind closed doors on a Sunday night in 1971. No tanks rolled into cities. No banks were set on fire. No emergency headlines screamed collapse. And yet, in less than 20 minutes, a single announcement rewrote the rules of global money forever. Most people have never heard the full story. Even fewer understand how close the system came to breaking, and why the same forces are building again today. Welcome to its financial history, too. This is the hidden truth of 1971, the moment the dollar nearly fell and the world changed without realizing it. To understand why 1971 was so dangerous, we need to go back to the end of World War II. The world was devastated. Europe was in ruins. Japan's economy was shattered. Entire nations were bankrupt. The United States, however, emerged stronger than ever. It controlled more than half of the world's industrial production and held roughly three-quarters of all the world's gold. In 1944, global leaders gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new financial system. Their goal was stability. Their solution was simple but powerful. The US dollar would be tied directly to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would become the center of global trade and finance. On paper, it looked like a fair system. In reality, it gave the United States something no empire in history had ever possessed: the ability to issue the world's primary money. As long as other countries trusted that US dollars could be exchanged for gold at any time, the system worked. For a while, it worked perfectly, but embedded in that system was a fatal flaw. The United States could print dollars far more easily than it could mine gold, and over time, that imbalance began to grow. By the 1950s and 1960s, America's role in the world had expanded dramatically. The Cold War demanded massive military spending across the globe. The Vietnam War drained enormous resources year after year. At home, social programs expanded rapidly. All of it was paid for not with gold, but with dollars. The problem was simple but dangerous. More dollars were being created than the gold reserves could realistically support. Foreign governments began to notice. One of them was France. French President Charles de Gaulle openly criticized the system, arguing that the United States was abusing its special position. France began converting its dollar reserves into physical gold and demanding delivery. Other countries quietly followed. Gold started leaving U.S. vaults at an alarming rate. Confidence, the real backbone of the system, began to crack. The 1960s were still the height of American financial dominance. Global trade ran on dollars. Oil was priced in dollars. Central banks saved in dollars. To most of the world, the dollar looked unbreakable. But behind the scenes, U.S. gold reserves were shrinking while dollar obligations kept growing. The math no longer worked. If every country demanded its gold at once, the United States simply wouldn't have enough. That question haunted Washington. What happens if trust breaks? By the late 1960s, pressure was building rapidly. Speculators were betting against the dollar. Foreign governments were growing nervous. Inflation was rising. The system was under strain, and policymakers knew it. Then came August 15th, 1971. On a quiet Sunday evening, when financial markets were closed, President Richard Nixon appeared on television. What he announced stunned the world. The United States would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. The word temporary was used, but everyone who understood the system knew the truth. This was not temporary. It was irreversible. In plain terms, the United States had broken its promise. Dollars could no longer be exchanged for gold. The foundation of the global monetary system collapsed in an instant. This was not a minor policy change. It was an emergency decision. If the gold window had remained open, the remaining U.S. gold reserves could have been drained completely. The dollar didn't collapse that night, but it stood at the edge of the cliff. What followed was chaos, even if it didn't look dramatic at first. Currencies began floating freely against each other. Exchange rates became volatile. Inflation surged throughout the 1970s. The dollar lost massive purchasing power. Ordinary people felt it through rising prices, oil shocks, and economic instability. For the first time in modern history, the global financial system was no longer anchored to anything physical. Money was now backed by confidence alone. Many expected the dollar to fall apart completely. It didn't, but not because the system was healthy. The United States replaced gold with something else: power, military dominance, political influence, control of trade routes, and later, the petrodollar system ensured that global demand for dollars remained strong. Oil-producing nations priced oil in dollars, forcing countries to hold and use them. The dollar survived, but at a cost. Inflation ravaged savings. Economic instability became normal, and monetary crises became recurring events rather than rare disasters. Governments attempted to manage the consequences. Interest rates were raised sharply in the late 1970s and early 1980s to stop runaway inflation. It worked, but only by triggering severe recessions. The underlying issue remained untouched. Money was now created without natural limits. Every crisis that followed was handled the same way. In 1987, liquidity was injected. In 2000, interest rates were slashed. In 2008, trillions were created out of thin air. In 2020, even more followed. Each time, the system survived, but became more fragile. What makes 1971 so important is that it set this pattern in motion. And today, the parallels are impossible to ignore. U.S. debt is vastly higher than it was in 1971. Confidence is increasingly strained. Countries are diversifying away from the dollar. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. Trade agreements are being settled outside the dollar system. Just like before, most people believe the system is stable simply because it exists. That belief is exactly what makes it dangerous. History shows that monetary systems rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They erode quietly. Trust fades slowly. And then one day, the rules change again. There are 3 lessons 1971 leaves behind. First, money backed only by trust works until it doesn't. Trust is invisible, but once it breaks, it cannot be printed. Second, 1971 did not end instability. It institutionalized it. From that moment on, constant intervention became necessary just to keep the system running. Third, every major monetary breakdown begins with denial. The belief that this time is different is always strongest right before change becomes unavoidable. The dollar almost collapsed in 1971, not in fire or panic, but in silence. And the most dangerous financial moments in history are always the quiet ones. If you want to understand the future of money, power, and global control, you have to understand the day the old rules died. If this story challenged what you thought you knew, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share. It was someone who believes money is just paper. Because the next shift won't be announced on a Sunday night. And most people won't see it coming at all.